Hey y'all, and welcome back to Confederate Shop's YouTube channel. Thank you so much for following my newsletter too. If you are not familiar with my newsletter, it is a once a week publication I come out with. It has articles in it. It also has specials and deals that I'm having on my website, confederateshop.com. So if you're not signed up for that, go to my website, scroll to the bottom of the page, and enter your email, and you can receive these updates, these video updates, and articles and deals on our books each and every week, and I would sincerely appreciate your support there. This week, I have a hidden gem, and if you're not familiar with our hidden gem, it is a book series that I have where I take one book out of my library and I feature it here in a video to tell you why you should have it on your bookshelf. These are books that don't really catch a lot of attention. They may not sell very well, but it's still a book I think you ought to have. So today's book is actually by an author you may have heard of, J. William Jones. Now, J. William Jones was a chaplain in the Army of Northern Virginia. He was also a pastor, Little River Baptist Church. Many of you probably never heard of that. He was also the Secretary of the Army of Northern Virginia, and he was heavily involved after the war in the Southern Historical Society. But most of all, he was an author that chose to defend and vindicate the South and some of the subjects that needed to be talked about after the war. One of his most well-known books is Christ in the Camp. Now, unfortunately, I have sold out of that book. That book is also out of print, but it's a great book to have. One book that pertains to that subject that I do have that I suggest you get is Great Revival in the Southern Armies. But I do have one of J. William Jones's books, and it's our hidden gem this week. It is called Confederate View of the Treatment of Prisoners. Now, this subject is huge. It's very important too. And what this book does is it covers many of the testimonials, many of the firsthand accounts, much of the correspondence from Northerners and from court cases that took place after the war. Now, this subject isn't talked about a whole lot. When it comes to prisoners of war and the war for Southern independence, mostly you will hear about Andersonville. This book also talks about Andersonville, and I wanted to cover a few facts about Andersonville that you may not have known. What occurred there was absolutely horrible, right? Nobody will deny that, but I want to make a point to say, between North and South, prisoners of war, both Union and Confederate, the deaths among the camps North and South were comparable to one another. Most of the deaths that occurred, most of the Union deaths that occurred, specifically in Andersonville, occurred after 1864. You see, by, I think it was 1863, the North had decided they were no longer going to exchange prisoners any longer. By this time, 1864, as that year rolled around, Andersonville had prisoners dying left and right. You had officers and commanders who were sending letters to the Confederate government saying, we need help, we need to do something. Andersonville tried to give their prisoners back to the Union with no compensation. You don't need to give us our officers, you don't need to give us our troops, just please take them. They're starving, they're dying. That's one thing people don't know about Andersonville. Another fact, which this book will talk about, is that between the guards and the prisoners themselves, the Union prisoners, the percentage of death rate was comparable between the two. You had guards dying at the same rate as the prisoners, and that's because everyone was starving because the South had no supplies. This book is also going to talk about the Henry Wirz case. Now, Henry Wirz was an immigrant. He was also the commander of Andersonville. So it's going to vindicate him in what occurred at Andersonville too. So it's going to talk about Andersonville. It's also going to talk about the treatment of Confederate prisoners up north. And like I said, there are testimonies in here. There are letters in here, correspondence in here. And it's just a all-around interesting book to learn about and read about. I've said this before, when it comes to these type of war crimes, these type of things that happened, the only justice that will ever come for our Confederate prisoners up north that died in those prison camps is us talking about it and shedding light on the truth and what happened there. Now, As I said before, between North and South, prisoners of war, both Union and Confederate, the deaths were comparable to one another. Now, the South has a good, I don't want to use the word excuse, but they have a good reason why all the prisoners had died, or many of the prisoners had died. And that's because they didn't have the food, they didn't have the supplies, they didn't have anything really adequate to facilitate that many prisoners at that time. The North did. The North had the food, they had the medicine, they had the blankets, they had the supplies in order to build better housing, but many times they chose not to, and that's really the crazy thing, and that's the thing that this book is going to talk about. It's going to talk about that injustice and shed light onto it. So this book is going to be on sale this week too. Get it. Support our work here at ConfederateShop.com. And as always, thank you so much for supporting us. Y'all have a wonderful day.